critically analyzing global affairs. The Muckrakers on today's News Talk, TNT.
Well, it's just gone 12 noon in London, 7 a.m. in Philadelphia, and around the world, it's time for the Muckrakers. Well, a very warm welcome back to the Muckrakers with me, Andrew Eborn. And as always, here on the Muckrakers, we pledge to continue tackling the world's most pressing and controversial news issues of our time. Our mission here is to provide more light and less heat on the matters that really concern you. And we're continuing our unwavering quest, if you like, to uncover the truth and to form, educate and entertain with dignity and respect. As always, it's vital we don't just ask the questions, but question those answers. Well, today, as Keir Starmer is set to announce things can only get worse, we're going to discuss just how bad it really is under the new Starmer regime, including government tyranny, media manipulation and misrepresentation. And today on the Muckrakers, I'm delighted that it's made up of myself, Andrew Eborn, together with TNT host James Friedman, and the wonderful Dan Wootton will be joining us as well. For those of you who don't know, Dan Wootton is a high-profile New Zealand and British journalist and broadcaster. He's worked for News of the World, The Sun on Sunday, where he became editor of the very famous and glorious Bizarre column. He also worked for The Sun, Mail Online and GB News, and has made appearances on Showbiz Presenter on things like ITV breakfast shows such as Lorraine and Daybreak. Dan now has his own media platform, the wonderful Outspoken. No spin, no bias, and no censorship. Things can only get worse. This is what Keir Starmer's warning us. He's trying to manage our expectation in his first keynote speech as PM. And you might recall back in 2010, the new coalition spent the first few months reiterating the line that Labour had caused economic chaos. And there was that very famous note, I'm afraid there is no money. Liam Byrne, the Chief Secretary to the Treasury under Gordon Brown, he left that note for his successor. Well, just how bad is it? Let's start with you, James.
Yeah, look, I read the Times this morning. Starmer's due to give a speech to this week. And it's interesting that the Times has actually got the details of the speech. But anyway, he's expected to use the recent riots, apparently, as a metaphor and say that I feel pride of the people who cleaned up the streets, rebuilt wars and repaired the damage. He's apparently going to go on to say, I thought of the obvious parallels, because imagine the pride we will feel as a nation after the hard work of cleaning up is done, as we will have a country that we built together, built to last. Oh, my God, if that's not a big pile of, then I really don't know what is, because what Starmer is intending to do is to pin all of the blame for the unpopular policies we know are coming. There's many of us that are worried about these new taxes they're going to bring in. And of course, there's all the issues about free speech, digital ID and all these things that we know are coming. But he's going to pin all of that and the excuse for doing it all on the Tories, clearing up their mess. But, you know, if we look back at the last 4 years, and, you know, we look at what's happened, probably one of the biggest events, well, the biggest event, I think, that has happened to the country since the Second World War. And Labour voted through every single COVID policy without any scrutiny whatsoever. So closing down the economy, furlough, test and trace, which cost, what was it, 37 billion, something like that. Loans to businesses to reconfigure their premises to make them COVID compliant, turning the NHS into the National COVID Service and closing down schools. All of this cost the country. I mean, you know, there's estimates, but it ranges between around 360 billion to around 400 billion. I think it's probably higher than that. But if we say that it's 400 billion, that's £6,000 for every single soul living in the country. And, you know, so Labour cannot just say, well, look, Conservatives left the country in a mess and now we've got to do all these nasty things because of those dastardly Conservatives. The other thing is, you know, if we take it's starting the firing pistol of its new government as any kind of sign and direction it's going in, well, it gave a 22% pay offer to the British Medical Association, all the doctors, 15% pay offer to the train drivers. It's given 11.6 billion in overseas aid to fight the climate crisis around the world, and it intends to invest more than 100 billion on net zero by 2030, which will lead to higher bills for us all and also lower productivity. Now, as far as I can see, this is a trick. We all know about the uni party, and you talked then, Andrew, about 2010 when the Labour Party lost power, and they left a note, didn't they, for the Conservatives saying all the money's gone. And of course, they did the same thing then. The Conservatives came in and they said, we've got to have a decade of austerity because of what Labour did. And yet, they found 400 billion, no problem at all. So this is just all a big trick. And in the meantime, over that decade of austerity, we've seen the national debt go from 1.5 trillion pounds in 2010 to 2.2 trillion today. That's an increase of 70% of GDP in 2010 to just short of 100% of GDP at the end of July this year. This is just a big con trick. It is the trick of the uni party to blame the other wing of the uni party for daylight robbery. That's how I see it, Andrew.
No, and it makes so many interesting points. They always say history repeats itself because we don't learn the lessons from history, and each party blames the other. One of the things I found astonishing during the election campaign is that nobody spoke about COVID and the dreadful measures and the terrible devastation that was affected as a result. Why do you think that was?
Well, hang on a sec. Before we say we don't learn the lessons of history, this is by design. This is not a case of, wow, we let them get away with blaming the other party. This is by design. The pendulum swings from one side to the other, and it's like they're passing ball. They're having a game of tennis. And behind the scenes, the establishment, whoever they are, I think these days it's the global elite, are controlling things. They're setting the country in the direction that they want to take it in, and to hell with the people and what they want. That is the result. So, as always, Andrew, I've answered a different question to you asked. So please, can you repeat the actual question?
Oh, no, I was just asking why all the parties were sort of silent, if you like, during the whole election campaign about COVID and the measures that were brought in, the devastation that was caused, and the things that are coming to light now.
Because what would they have said? They were all complicit, and so they were all complicit in silence afterwards. I don't think there's anything positive, really, that any of the politicians could have said, apart from sorry. And that's not a great, a great.
So, sorry's a start, though, isn't it? I think for some people, sorry would have been a start. I mean, sorry for the devastation caused. Sorry for the disruption for all of the people in their school education. Sorry for the excess deaths. And we had, you remember this time last week, we had the wonderful Andrew Bridgen on. Sunlight is the best disinfectant. We need to turn around and learn those lessons to realise that mistakes were made. Now, I get it that we can't all be experts, but there was an over-reliance on experts, as a result of which horrendous damage was caused. And the starting point could have been, sorry, we're looking into this, in the same way as you have things like the scandal about the post office, the infected blood, and so on and so forth. We can't keep sweeping these things under the carpet, can we?
I think the sorry that most politicians should have said, actually, is we're sorry for being so naive and for being so utterly controlled by the global narrative, by the globalists. I think that is the sorry, actually, most of them, because contrary to, I think, most people on social media during the COVID period, everybody said, well, they're all in on it. All of the MPs, they're all part of a plan, they're all in on it. That's not true. I think most MPs were just as blind as most of the public to what was going on. And of course, as an MP, you've got the whips. You're absolutely fearful of the power of the whips, and you don't want to be ousted and made a scapegoat like Andrew Bridgen. So you're very, very careful of where you get your information from. And so I think most MPs during the COVID period were just wrapped up in a bubble of information, of misinformation. So a lot of them actually didn't know what was going on. I think they started to realise as time went on. And of course, Andrew Bridgen pointed that out. He talked about there are scores of MPs that have been vaccine injured, or they've got family members that have been vaccine injured. But I think by that time, they'd they towed the government line so hard up to that point that it became very, very politically difficult, I think, for them to stand up and then start talking the truth, which is a shame, because that's what we need of our parliamentarians. We need people with guts, people with honesty and integrity who can stand up and actually say, do you know what? I got it wrong and I'm sorry for that. And very, very sadly, we've seen hardly any politicians, if any. I mean, Andrew Bridgen did, because he did push the vaccines at the start. He did apologise and then started speaking the truth. But I think, him, I can't think of anyone anyone else, Andrew, off the top of my head. 650 people.
Extraordinary, isn't it? No, and what I loved about last week's programme, I mean, Andrew peeked beneath the kimono, if you like, about what goes on in those hallowed halls at Westminster, and how people are basically, they say it's supposed to be without fear or favour. Well, Andrew made it very clear that it's both. People are scared, and the favours is some of the people, their silence is bought off, including by given seats in the Lords. But I want to turn back to Starmer, because that's our sort of main focus, and praise to Mike and his brilliant graphics today. I always get a chance to see these after the show, which is wonderful. So I can peek on this and sort of monitor there. The response to the criticism about Labour blaming the Tories, the previous party, basically they've been told that they've been exaggerating the economic challenges and breaking tax promises. And critics basically argue that Labour's plans prioritise union demands over pensioners and working people. And I want to just turn briefly before the break to the winter fuel allowance, because Chancellor Rachel Reeves, she says the winter fuel payments will now be restricted to those on pension credits or other means-tested benefits. She says the Labour government has inherited a projected overspend of 22 billion from the Conservatives, and it's basically an overspend, she says, on the asylum system, including the disastrous Rwanda plan, which has now been scrapped, and that was more than 6.4 billion for this year alone, she says. She's also cancelled some road and rail projects, including the tunnel under Stonehenge, and she's confirmed the government has made a 22% two-year pay offer to junior doctors, teachers and NHS workers are also set to get a 5.5% rise. Now, Jeremy Hunt says Reeves is shameless in paving the way for tax rises, and October's budget will be the biggest betrayal in history by a new Chancellor. What's your take on that, James?
Yeah, I think it is, because particularly, putting aside the fact that they said there would be no tax rises, when you look at the overwhelming, the overarching context to all of this, is that Labour got in on 20% of the vote, 1 in 5. That's it, and for that, it's got 2/3 of the seats in Parliament. It does need, I think, to reflect that context in how it approaches government, because it hasn't got a mandate from the British people to just do whatever it wants. It did make some promises in the run-up to the election campaign. And let's be clear, 22 billion in the big scheme of things, if they're talking about a black hole, is minuscule. It really is. I mean, they've just given away 11.6 billion in foreign aid to help fight the climate crisis abroad. They're going to spend 100 billion. I think it's going to be much higher than that by 2030 on investment in net zero, achieving net zero, which, by the way, is going to make us all poorer in the process and lead to lower productivity. So these are political choices. You cannot just blame this on the former Conservative government. But look, Andrew, you know my thoughts on this. The big picture in all of this is the fact that Labour are just the other wing of the uni party. This isn't just a sort of random event where the Conservatives let us down, so then we voted in Labour. No, this is a handing of the baton to the other wing of the party, and to give fresh political impetus to be able to do all of the things which they want to do. Mark my words, Andrew, digital ID, CBDCs, police state with facial recognition. We're already starting to see that. They're going to revisit the online safety bill. We've been warning about this for the last 4 years. So it's no surprise to me seeing what we're seeing, really.
No, you're absolutely right. And before the break, I mean, Shadow Home Secretary James Cleverly, he's basically accused Labour of conning the electorate, betraying the British people by axing pensioners' winter fuel payments. It's going to be horrendous, and it's going to be the choice between eating or heating yet again for these poor pensioners. It is a betrayal. And I always make the point, justice should not just be done, but be seen to be done. And justice is supposed to be blind. Doesn't matter what colour, creed or religion, so on and so forth. The other point I would make very, very quickly before the end of today's show is they're now starting to look at WhatsApp messages. And people used to think that WhatsApp messages were encrypted private conversations. But ever since the Wayne Couzens case, and it's a primary school teacher as well, they're now looking at that. Very quickly, Dan, 10 seconds. What's your take on that?
I think it's really chilling. Kelly J. Keane has moved all of her conversations off WhatsApp. It feels like no sort of communication is safe, but we can't be afraid, is my message, Andrew, because if we stop speaking out, then what about ordinary folks? We all have to be brave. They can't arrest us all for thought crimes.
The prisons are not big enough. One in, one out. Dan, we'll keep doing that. That's Dan Wootton, the brilliant host of the wonderful Outspoken. Do and have a look at that. Sign up today. Basil and James, a real pleasure. Dan, we're going to get you back in glorious Technicolor next time. But for me, Andrew Eborn, I'll see you tomorrow. Take care.
If you missed this hour, simply go to episodes at tntradio.live